A cold wind swept through the streets of Eureka, Nevada, as Katherine Kennedy clutched her tattered shawl tighter around her trembling shoulders. The year was 1876, and the mining town's prosperity had long since passed her by. The weight of the stolen loaf pressed against her ribs beneath the fabric, but the thought of her 3 hungry children waiting in their dilapidated cabin gave her the courage to quicken her pace, even as shouts erupted behind her. "Stop that woman! Thief! Thief!" The baker's voice boomed through the dusty street, causing passers-by to turn and stare. Katherine's heart hammered in her chest as she broke into a run, her worn boots slipping in the mud from yesterday's rain. She never saw the man who stepped out from between 2 buildings, his tall frame blocking her path like a sudden mountain rising before her. Katherine collided with him, the impact knocking the hidden bread from her grasp. It fell to the ground, landing in a puddle as her hopes shattered alongside it. "Please," she whispered, raising her eyes to meet those of the stranger. "My children haven't eaten in 2 days." The man before her stood over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders clad in a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt. A weathered Stetson hat shaded eyes the color of a summer sky. He looked down at the mud-splattered bread, then back at Katherine's face, where desperation had carved lines that made her appear older than her 26 years. "There she is." The baker's voice drew closer, accompanied by the heavy footfalls of the town sheriff. Katherine Kennedy felt her world collapsing. Widowed for 8 months after her husband James had died in a mining accident, she'd struggled to keep their 3 children, Emma, age 7, Thomas, age 5, and little Sarah, just 3, fed and sheltered. The small settlement they'd received from the mining company had run out weeks ago. "Is there a problem here?" The tall stranger's deep voice rolled like distant thunder as he addressed the approaching men, while smoothly retrieving the fallen bread and brushing it clean. Sheriff Donovan reached them first, his thick gray mustache twitching with annoyance. "This woman stole from Hobson's bakery, Mr. Forrester. Stand aside so justice can be served." The stranger, Mr. Forrester, glanced down at Katherine, then back to the sheriff. "There must be some mistake." "This is my bread." Katherine's eyes widened in shock as he continued. "I paid for it myself not 10 minutes ago and asked my friend here to collect it while I tended to my horse." His voice remained steady, the lie flowing as naturally as water down a mountainside. "That ain't true." Hobson the baker protested, his face flushed red beneath his flour-dusted hairline. "This woman came into my shop, and when I turned my back, she snatched a loaf and ran." The stranger, whose first name Katherine still didn't know, removed his hat and ran a hand through sun-bleached golden hair. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Yates Forrester, just arrived from Carson City. I can assure you, Sheriff, this bread has been paid for." He reached into his pocket and pulled out several coins, extending them toward the baker. "If there's any confusion about payment, I'm happy to settle the matter now." Sheriff Donovan's eyes narrowed suspiciously, glancing between Katherine's trembling form and the composed stranger. "You vouch for this woman, Mr. Forrester?" "Absolutely." Yates Forrester's answer came without hesitation. In fact, he paused and Katherine felt the weight of his gaze upon her face. "This lady is my intended." Katherine nearly stumbled backward in shock, but Yates placed a steadying hand at the small of her back. "Your intended." The sheriff's bushy eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Never seen her with you before." "We've been corresponding by letter for some months," Yates explained smoothly. "I've come to Eureka to make her my wife, to give her children a father again." He turned to Katherine, his eyes conveying a silent message, "Play along." "Isn't that right, my dear?" Katherine's throat felt dry as desert sand, but she managed a nod. "Yes, that's correct." Hobson the baker still looked unconvinced, but when Yates pressed the coins into his flour-dusted palm, the man reluctantly backed down. "Fine, then. But keep a better eye on your woman, Forrester. Folks in Eureka don't tolerate thieves." He turned and stomped back toward his bakery. The sheriff lingered a moment longer, studying Catherine's face. "Mrs. Kennedy, is what Mr. Forrester says true? Have you been promised to this man?" Catherine felt trapped between the crushing weight of her desperate circumstances and the lie this stranger had created. "We've been writing to each other since James passed," she forced herself to say, hoping her children would forgive the falsehood if it meant they would eat tonight. Sheriff Donovan finally nodded, though suspicion still clouded his eyes. "Very well, but I'll be keeping an eye on this situation." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Catherine alone with her mysterious savior. When the men were out of earshot, Catherine turned to face Yates Forrester, clutching the rescued bread to her chest. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yates replaced his hat, casting his face in shadow once more. "No mother should have to steal to feed her children." He glanced down the road. "Where do you live, Mrs. Kennedy? I should walk you home in case our sheriff decides to follow." Catherine hesitated, torn between gratitude and caution. This man was a stranger, yet he had just saved her from jail or worse, from having her children taken away. "It's not far, just beyond the edge of town near the creek." They walked in silence, Catherine acutely aware of the tall figure beside her. Yates Forrester moved with the easy grace of a man accustomed to life outdoors, his stride long but measured to accommodate her shorter steps. "You're not really looking for a wife, are you, Mr. Forrester?" Catherine finally asked as they neared the weathered cabin she called home. A small smile curved the corner of his mouth. "No, madam, I can't say that was my purpose in coming to Eureka." "Then why lie to the sheriff?" Yates paused, turning to face her. "Because I've seen what happens to women left alone with children in towns like this. The law isn't always kind to those who are desperate." Before Catherine could respond, the cabin door burst open and Emma raced out, her dark hair flying behind her. "Mama, you're back." Thomas followed close behind, his small face brightening at the sight of the bread. Little Sarah tottered after her siblings, thumb firmly planted in her mouth. "Children," Catherine said, her voice steadier than she felt, "this is Mr. Forrester. He helped me in town today." Emma regarded the tall stranger with solemn eyes that had seen too much hardship for her young age. "Are you a friend of our mama?" Yates crouched down to the child's level, removing his hat. "I'd like to be, miss. What's your name?" "I'm Emma Kennedy. I'm 7. She pointed to her siblings. "That's Thomas, he's 5, and that's Sarah, she's only 3. Yates nodded solemnly to each child. "It's a pleasure to meet you all." Catherine ushered the children back inside, then turned to Yates. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Forrester. I don't know how I'll repay you. There's nothing to repay." He replaced his hat, stepping back. "But Mrs. Kennedy, the sheriff, and that baker aren't likely to forget this incident. They'll be watching you now." Catherine's shoulders sagged with the truth of his words. One moment of desperation had branded her a thief in the eyes of the town, and her children would suffer for it. "What am I to do?" "I've applied for every position I can find, but no one will hire a woman with 3 young children." Yates was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the mountains in the distance. "I'm staying at the Silverton Hotel. If you need anything, well, you know where to find me." He tipped his hat and turned to leave. "Mr. Forrester," Catherine called after him. "What brought you to Eureka in the first place?" He looked back over his shoulder, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Just passing through, Mrs. Kennedy, just passing through." As Catherine closed the door behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that fate had sent Yates Forrester into her path for a reason. She broke the bread into portions, giving the children slightly larger pieces than her own, and watched as they devoured the simple meal with relief. That night, after tucking the children into the single bed they shared, Catherine sat by the dying embers in the hearth and contemplated her situation. The cabin, once her husband's pride, was falling into disrepair. The roof leaked in 3 places. The winter would be harsh, and she had no means to buy coal or enough food to sustain them through the cold months. And now she was known as a thief. Mourning brought no solutions, but it did bring a knock at her door. Katherine opened it cautiously to find Sheriff Donovan standing there, his expression grim. "Mrs. Kennedy," he began without preamble, "I've received complaints from several merchants in town. They're concerned about having a person of your character near their establishments." Katherine's face flushed with shame and anger. "Sheriff, I've never stolen anything before yesterday. I was desperate. Save it, Mrs. Kennedy." The sheriff cut her off with a raised hand. "The town council has decided. Either you marry this Forrester fellow and prove you're a respectable woman with a man to provide for you and these children, or you'll be asked to leave Eureka by the end of the month." Katherine stared at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious. This is our home. Should have thought of that before you turned to thieving." The sheriff's voice held no sympathy. "End of the month, Mrs. Kennedy, or find yourself a husband." He turned and walked back to his horse, leaving Katherine standing in the doorway, her world once again upended. After sending the children to gather kindling near the creek close enough that she could watch from the cabin window, Katherine made her way into town. The stares and whispers followed her down the main street, confirming what the sheriff had told her. In the eyes of Eureka, she was now an undesirable, a criminal, a woman without honor. The Silverton Hotel stood 3 stories tall at the center of town, its painted facade peeling in places but still maintaining an air of frontier elegance. Katherine hesitated at the entrance, gathering her courage before pushing through the doors. The lobby was quiet at this hour, with only the desk clerk and a couple of men playing cards in the corner. The clerk looked up, his expression souring when he recognized her. "Mr. Yates Forrester, please," Katherine said, keeping her voice steady despite the clerk's obvious disdain. "Mr. Forrester ain't taking visitors," the clerk replied, turning back to his ledger. "Tell him Mrs. Kennedy is here. He'll see me." She hoped the confidence in her voice would mask her uncertainty. The clerk sighed heavily but dispatched a boy to carry the message upstairs. Katherine waited, feeling the stares of the card players boring into her back. Minutes later, Yates appeared on the stairs, his expression showing surprise that quickly shifted to concern when he saw Katherine's face. "Mrs. Kennedy," he said, crossing the lobby to her, "is everything all right? Might we speak privately, Mr. Forrester?" She asked, acutely aware of the eavesdropping around them. Yates nodded, offering his arm in a gesture that was both protective and proprietary for the benefit of onlookers. He led her to a small sitting room off the main lobby, closing the door behind them. "What's happened?" he asked once they were alone. Katherine related her encounter with the sheriff, her voice growing stronger with indignation as she spoke. "It's absurd. They can't force me to marry or leave town. It was one loaf of bread." Yates listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as she continued. When she finished, he paced the small room, hands clasped behind his back. "It's not unheard of," he finally said. "Towns like Eureka pride themselves on being respectable. A woman without a husband, especially one caught stealing." "I have nowhere else to go," Katherine admitted, hating the desperation in her voice. "James and I spent everything we had to build that cabin. The children were born there. It's all we have left of him." Yates stopped pacing and turned to face her, his blue eyes intent on hers. "What about family? Do you have relatives who might take you in?" Katherine shook her head. "My parents died when I was young. James's family is back east and they never approved of him marrying me or moving west." She twisted her hands in her lap. "Mr. Forrester, I don't know why I came here. You've already done more than enough for a stranger." "Mrs. Kennedy," Yates said, his voice gentler than she had yet heard it, "sometimes strangers are just friends we haven't properly met yet." He took the chair opposite her. "Tell me about yourself. How did you come to Eureka?" Katherine found herself recounting her story how she'd met James Kennedy at 17 when he'd come to work at her uncle's store in Missouri, their whirlwind courtship and marriage, and their journey west when news of silver strikes in Nevada promised a better life. How James had worked the mines while she tended their growing family, how they'd scraped by even as other miners struck it rich. How the tunnel collapse 8 months ago had taken him and 5 other men, leaving her alone with 3 children and dwindling resources. The mine company paid a settlement, she explained. But medical bills for Thomas, he'd taken ill with fever last winter, ate through most of it. I've tried to find work, but… She gestured helplessly. And now they expect you to find a husband in what, 3 weeks? Yates shook his head, his expression troubled. It's not right. No, Katherine agreed, but it's reality. She rose to her feet. I apologize for taking up your time, Mr. Forrester. I should get back to my children. Yates stood as well, towering over her in the small room. Mrs. Kennedy. Katherine, he hesitated, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. What if you did marry? Katherine looked up at him, bewildered. Mr. Forrester, I hardly think any man in Eureka is going to propose to the town thief. I meant, what if you married me? The words hung in the air between them, as shocking as a gunshot in a quiet room. Katherine stared at him, certain she'd misheard. You can't be serious, she finally managed. I am entirely serious. Yates ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. Look, I told the sheriff we were intended to be married. If we follow through, it solves your immediate problem. Mr. Forrester, we are complete strangers. Not complete, he countered. I know you're a devoted mother who would risk public shame to feed your children. I know you loved your husband enough to follow him across the country chasing a dream. I know you're proud and brave and at the end of your rope. His voice softened. And you know I'm a man who keeps his word. Katherine sank back into her chair, overwhelmed. Why would you do this? What could you possibly gain from marrying a widow with 3 children and a reputation for theft? Yates didn't answer immediately, his gaze turning toward the window where late autumn sunlight streamed through lace curtains. Let's just say I understand what it means to be judged unfairly, to have your whole life determined by one moment, one decision. Something in his tone made Katherine wonder what story lay beneath his words, what ghosts he carried with him. Mr. Forrester, marriage is a sacred covenant. I won't enter into it lightly, even to save my home. I understand, he turned back to her. But consider this, it would be a marriage of convenience, an arrangement beneficial to us both. You gain respectability and security for your children, I gain. He paused, a home, a purpose. And what happens when you tire of us? When the burden of an instant family becomes too heavy? I'm not proposing we share a bed, Mrs. Kennedy, Yates said bluntly, causing color to rise in Katherine's cheeks. Just a name, a legal arrangement that can be dissolved when your circumstances improve. Katherine rose again, needing space to think. I need time to consider this, Mr. Forrester. It's not just my life at stake, of course. He moved to open the door for her. But Katherine, he added softly, using her given name for the first time, time is the one thing you don't have in abundance. The walk home gave Katherine space to think, though her mind whirled with the impossibility of her situation. Marry a stranger or lose her home. What kind of choice was that? Yet as she approached the cabin and saw Emma teaching little Sarah to make daisy chains while Thomas carefully stacked the kindling he'd gathered, she knew there was no choice at all. Her children needed stability, safety, a roof over their heads. Could she provide that by accepting Yates Forrester's extraordinary offer? That evening, after the children were asleep, Katherine sat at the rough-hewn table and wrote down every reason why marrying Yates Forrester was a terrible idea. He was a stranger. He might be running from something. Why else would a man just passing through offer marriage to a woman he barely knew? He could be violent, dishonest, or worse. Then she wrote down the reasons why she should accept. Her children needed a home. Winter was coming. The town had turned against her. And Yates had already shown kindness when he could have simply walked away. By midnight, Katherine had made her decision. The next morning, she walked into town once more, this time with her children in tow, dressed in their best clothes, which weren't much, but were clean and carefully mended. She found Yates at the livery stable, examining a chestnut mare. He looked up as they approached, surprise registering briefly before he composed his features into a friendly smile for the children. "Mrs. Kennedy," he greeted her, then nodded to each child. "Miss Emma, Mr. Thomas, Miss Sarah. A pleasure to see you all this fine morning." Emma, always the boldest, stepped forward. "Mama says you might become our new papa. Is that true?" Katherine flushed at her daughter's directness, but Yates didn't seem perturbed. He crouched down to Emma's level, meeting her serious gaze with his own. "That depends on whether your mama thinks it's a good idea," he answered honestly, "and on whether you children would be willing to have me as part of your family." Thomas, who had been hanging back shyly, moved closer. "Do you know how to fish? Our papa used to take us fishing at the creek." "I do know how to fish," Yates confirmed, "and I'd be honored to take you if your mama approves." Little Sarah, still clinging to Katherine's skirts, studied Yates with solemn eyes before extending her small hand, offering him the slightly crushed daisy she had been holding. Yates accepted the flower with grave courtesy. "Thank you, Miss Sarah. That's the nicest gift I've received in a very long time." Katherine watched the interaction, struck by the gentle way Yates spoke to her children, the respect he showed them. James had been a good father, but like many men of his generation, he'd sometimes treated the children as small adults who should be seen and not heard. Yates seemed to genuinely value their thoughts and feelings. "Mr. Forrester," Katherine said when he stood up again, "might we speak privately for a moment?" Yates nodded, instructing the livery boy to watch the children for a few minutes. He led Katherine just outside the stable doors where they could still see the children but speak without being overheard. "I've decided to accept your proposal," Katherine said without preamble, "but I have conditions." Yates nodded, his expression serious. "I'd expect nothing less. First, this is a temporary arrangement. When I'm able to support my children on my own again, we will quietly dissolve this marriage." "Agreed." "Second, while I understand this is a marriage of convenience, I expect you to be a positive presence in my children's lives for as long as this arrangement lasts. They've lost enough already. I would never cause harm to a child, Mrs. Kennedy. You have my word on that." Katherine took a deep breath. "Third, I will not share your bed. We will maintain separate sleeping quarters." If Yates was offended by this condition, he didn't show it. "As I mentioned before, I'm not expecting that aspect of marriage from you." "And finally," Katherine continued, "I need to know why you're doing this. The real reason, Mr. Forrester. I won't enter into this agreement until I understand your motivation." Yates was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting past her to the mountains that framed the eastern edge of Eureka. "5 years ago," he finally said, his voice low enough that Katherine had to lean closer to hear him, "I was falsely accused of a crime I didn't commit. No one would listen to my side of the story. I lost everything: my ranch in Wyoming, my good name, nearly my life." Katherine waited silently as he continued. "I was saved by the kindness of a stranger, an old trapper who hid me until I could prove my innocence. By the time I cleared my name, my property was gone, sold off to cover supposed debts. I've been drifting ever since." He turned to face her, his blue eyes intense. "I know what it's like to be judged and found wanting based on appearances rather than truth. I couldn't stand by and watch it happen to you and your children." "So this is repaying a debt?" Katherine asked, trying to understand. "No," Yates shook his head. "This is doing what's right because I can, and maybe finding something I've been missing along the way." He gestured toward the stable where Emma was now showing Thomas how to feed a carrot to a gentle gray mare. "A home, a purpose, things worth staying in one place for." His honesty touched something in Katherine, a recognition of shared experience despite their different circumstances. "Thank you for telling me the truth." "Does that mean we have an agreement, Mrs. Kennedy?" Katherine nodded, extending her hand as if to seal a business arrangement. "We do, Mr. Forrester." Instead of shaking her hand, Yates took it gently in his larger one and raised it to his lips, brushing a kiss across her knuckles in a gesture that belonged to another world, another time. "Then I believe we should speak to the preacher as soon as possible." The wedding took place 3 days later in the small white church at the edge of town. Katherine wore her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days but was clean and carefully pressed. Emma had gathered wildflowers for a small bouquet, and even Thomas had polished his one pair of shoes until they gleamed. Yates surprised her by appearing in a new black suit, his usually unruly hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. He looked like a different man, more refined, almost handsome in a rugged way that Katherine tried not to notice. The ceremony was brief, attended only by the children, Sheriff Donovan, who seemed determined to verify the marriage was legitimate, and two of Yates's acquaintances from the hotel who served as witnesses. The preacher, a kind elderly man named Reverend Phillips, kept the service simple, though Katherine couldn't miss the way he emphasized the "until death do us part" portion of the vows. When it came time to seal their union with a kiss, Yates hesitated, his eyes meeting Katherine's in silent question. She gave a slight nod, and he leaned down to press his lips chastely against hers, a brief touch that shouldn't have left her feeling so flustered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Phillips announced, "may I present Mr. and Mrs. Yates Forrester." And just like that, Katherine Kennedy ceased to exist, replaced by Katherine Forrester, wife of a man she barely knew, bound by vows she'd never expected to speak again after James's death. Sheriff Donovan approached them as they exited the church, his expression still suspicious but less openly hostile than before. "Well, Forrester, you've made an honest woman of her," he said, his gaze flicking between them. "See that you keep it that way. This town's got no patience for troublemakers. Mrs. Forrester is not, and never was, a troublemaker," Yates replied, his arm sliding around Katherine's waist in a protective gesture that felt surprisingly natural. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd remember that in the future, Sheriff." Donovan harumphed but didn't push the issue. As he walked away, Katherine released the breath she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said quietly. Yates looked down at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Just doing what any husband would do, defending his wife's honor. The words sent an unexpected warmth through Katherine's chest, quickly tamped down by the reminder that this was not a real marriage, but a practical arrangement with an expiration date. That evening, Katherine prepared a simple wedding supper in their cabin. She'd used the last of her meager savings to buy a chicken, which she roasted with the few vegetables from her small garden. It wasn't much of a feast, but it was the best she could manage. The children were excited by the occasion, peppering Yates with questions throughout the meal. Where had he grown up? Wyoming, on a cattle ranch. Could he shoot a gun? Yes, though he preferred not to unless necessary. Did he know any stories? Many, and he proceeded to entertain them with a tale about a clever rabbit that had Thomas giggling uncontrollably. After the children were tucked into bed, Katherine and Yates found themselves alone for the first time as husband and wife. An awkward silence fell between them as they sat at the table, the remnants of their wedding supper still before them. "I've been thinking," Yates said finally, keeping his voice low to avoid waking the children. "This cabin is too small for all of us, especially with winter coming." Katherine tensed. "It's our home. My children were born here." "I understand that," Yates assured her quickly. "I'm not suggesting we leave, but I noticed the foundation for an addition on the north side. Was your husband planning to expand?" The mention of James's unfinished plans brought a lump to Katherine's throat. "Yes. He wanted to add 2 more rooms, one for the boys when Thomas got older, and a proper kitchen." Yates nodded. "With your permission, I'd like to complete that work. I have some savings and I'm good with my hands. We could have it done before the first snow." The offer stunned Katherine. She had assumed Yates would simply move his belongings into the cabin, and they would make do with the cramped quarters. The idea that he would invest his own money and labor into improving her home hadn't occurred to her. "You would do that." "It makes practical sense," Yates replied, though something in his expression suggested there was more to it than practicality. "The children need space to grow and—" He hesitated. "And we need separate quarters as agreed." Katherine considered his proposal. The addition would indeed make their living situation more comfortable, and it would fulfill James's dream for their home. "All right," she finally said, "but I insist on helping with the work." Yates smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "I wouldn't have it any other way, Mrs. Forrester." The use of her new name still felt strange, but Katherine found herself returning his smile. Perhaps this arrangement would work after all. The next morning, Yates rode into town to purchase lumber and supplies for the addition. While he was gone, Katherine explained to the children what would be happening. "Is Mr. Forrester Papa going to stay with us forever?" Emma asked, her young face serious. Katherine chose her words carefully. "Mr. Forrester has promised to take care of us, and he's going to help make our home bigger and better." "But is he our real papa now?" Thomas persisted. "He's your stepfather," Katherine explained. "He can never replace your real father, but he cares about you and wants to help us." Sarah, too young to fully understand the complexities of the situation, simply stated, "I like him, he's nice." Katherine smoothed her youngest child's hair. "Yes, he is nice, and we're very fortunate that he's come into our lives." When Yates returned that afternoon with a wagon full of supplies, the children ran out to greet him, their initial shyness apparently forgotten. He lifted Sarah onto his shoulders and let Thomas inspect the tools he'd bought, answering the boys' eager questions with patient detail. Over the next 2 weeks, the addition to the cabin took shape. Yates worked from dawn until dusk, with Katherine assisting whenever she wasn't tending to the children or household chores. She was surprised to discover that her new husband was indeed skilled with carpentry, his large hands capable of both strength and precision. They fell into an unexpected rhythm, working side by side during the day and sharing quiet conversations in the evenings after the children were asleep. Katherine learned that Yates had been a rancher before the false accusations that had appended his life, that he'd loved working with horses and cattle, and that he missed having land to call his own. In turn, she told him about growing up in Missouri, about her dreams of becoming a teacher before she'd fallen in love with James, about her hopes that her children would have better opportunities than she'd had. "Emma's smart as a whip," she told Yates one evening as they sat by the fire. "She deserves a proper education." "There's a school in Eureka," Yates pointed out. "Why isn't she attending?" Katherine's expression clouded. "The schoolmaster is Hobson's brother-in-law. After the incident with the bread, he made it clear Emma wasn't welcome." Anger flashed across Yates's face. "That's ridiculous. A child shouldn't be punished for her parents' supposed misdeeds." He stared into the fire for a long moment before adding, "I'll speak to him tomorrow. As her stepfather, it's my right to ensure she receives an education." "You don't need to fight my battles, Yates," Katherine said. Using his first name without thinking, he looked up at her, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "They're not just your battles anymore, Katherine, they're ours." The simple statement affected Katherine more deeply than she wanted to admit. For 8 months, she had carried every burden alone, made every decision without support, faced every challenge with only her own strength to rely on. The idea that someone strong and capable was now beside her, willing to share those burdens, was both frightening and profoundly comforting. The next day, true to his word, Yates visited the schoolhouse. He returned in the afternoon with news that Emma could begin classes the following Monday. "What did you say to change his mind?" Katherine asked as they continued work on the addition, now nearly complete with 2 small but sturdy rooms. Yates shrugged, hammering a nail into place with perhaps more force than necessary. "I simply reminded him that denying education to a child is contrary to both Christian values and the law. And that as a tax-paying citizen of Eureka, I would be most displeased if my stepdaughter were treated differently than any other child." Katherine suspected there was more to the conversation than Yates was revealing, but she didn't press. The result was what mattered: Emma would get her education. As promised, the addition was finished before the first snow fell. The new rooms transformed their living situation, providing much-needed space and privacy. Yates took one room for himself, while the other became a proper bedroom for the children, with bunks for Emma and Thomas and a small cot for Sarah. With the immediate housing concerns addressed, Yates turned his attention to their financial situation. One evening in late November, he broached the subject Katherine had been avoiding. "Winter's nearly upon us," he said as they sat at the table, going over the meager household accounts. "Our supplies won't last until spring." Katherine sighed, the reality of their situation weighing heavily on her. Despite Yates's help with the cabin, they were still barely scraping by. "I know. I've been trying to find work, but that's what I wanted to discuss," Yates interrupted gently. "I've been offered a job." Katherine looked up in surprise. "Where?" "The Double R Ranch, about 10 miles west of town. They need an experienced hand for the winter season, someone who knows cattle and can help with spring calving." "That's wonderful," Katherine said, genuinely pleased. Yates had mentioned more than once that he missed working with livestock. "When would you start?" "Next week." He hesitated before continuing. "The pay is better than I expected. It would see us through the winter comfortably, with enough left to buy seeds for a larger garden in spring." Katherine studied his face, sensing there was something more he wasn't saying. "What's the catch, Yates?" He met her gaze directly. "I'd be gone 5 days a week, coming home only on weekends. It's too far to ride back and forth each day, especially in winter weather." The news sank in slowly. After just a month of having Yates's steady presence in their home, the thought of him being gone most of the week felt strangely unsettling. "The children will miss you," Katherine said, not quite ready to admit that she might miss him too. "I'll miss them," Yates replied, his expression softening. "But this is a good opportunity, Katherine. It could be the start of something more permanent." Katherine understood what he meant. Ranch work suited Yates's skills and temperament far better than odd jobs in town. If he performed well this winter, it could lead to a year-round position, stability for all of them. "You should take it," she said firmly. "We'll manage while you're away." Relief crossed Yates's features. "Thank you. I promise I'll be home every weekend, no matter the weather." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, a gesture that was becoming less rare between them. "And I'll send most of the wages back with the ranch hands who come to town for supplies." The touch of his hand on hers sent warmth spreading up Katherine's arm, a sensation she quickly attributed to gratitude rather than anything more complicated. That weekend, before Yates was to start his new position, they celebrated Emma's 8th birthday. Katherine had managed to bake a small cake with precious sugar she'd been saving for a special occasion, and Yates surprised them all with gifts: a slate and chalk for Emma, a wooden horse he'd carved himself for Thomas, and a rag doll with button eyes for Sarah. For Katherine, he brought something unexpected: a book of poetry she'd once mentioned loving as a girl. "How did you remember?" she asked when he presented it to her that evening after the children were asleep. Yates smiled, the firelight casting warm shadows across his face. "I listen when you talk, Katherine." The simple statement touched her deeply. James, for all his good qualities, had often been too preoccupied with his dreams of striking it rich to truly hear her. That Yates, who had no obligation to care about her preferences or memories, had not only listened but acted on what he'd learned, stirred something in Katherine she'd thought long buried. The next morning, Yates packed his few belongings for the journey to the Double R. The children clung to him at the door, extracting promises that he would return with stories of the ranch and its animals. "Be good for your mother," he told them, ruffling Thomas's hair and kissing the tops of Emma's and Sarah's heads. "I'll be back before you know it." When it was time to say goodbye to Katherine, an awkward moment passed between them. They had shared a home for a month, worked side by side, talked late into the night, yet their marriage remained a practical arrangement, their physical contact limited to occasional, almost accidental touches. "Take care of yourself," Katherine said, standing in the doorway as Yates mounted his horse. He looked down at her, his expression inscrutable. "You too, Catherine. If you need anything, we'll be fine," she assured him, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cold. "The children and I have managed before." Something like hurt flashed across Yates's face, there and gone so quickly Catherine thought she might have imagined it. "I know you can manage without me," he said quietly, "but you don't have to anymore." With that, he tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Catherine standing in the doorway with a strange emptiness in her chest that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. The first week without Yates was an adjustment. The children asked for him constantly, especially at bedtime when he had taken to telling them stories. Catherine did her best to fill the void, but she found herself missing his quiet strength, his dry humor, and even the sound of his boots on the wooden floor. When Friday evening arrived with no sign of Yates, Catherine told herself not to worry. Travel in winter could be unpredictable, and he might have been delayed. But as darkness fell and still he didn't appear, concern began to gnaw at her. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold. Catherine was just preparing breakfast when the sound of hoofbeats approached the cabin. Relief flooded through her, quickly followed by irritation at her own reaction. She shouldn't be this affected by Yates's comings and goings. The door opened, and there he stood, snow dusting his shoulders, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. The children abandoned their places at the table, rushing to greet him with excited cries and eager questions. Yates scooped Sarah up with one arm while ruffling Thomas's hair with his free hand. "I've missed you too, little ones," he said, his voice warm with affection. "And I've brought something for each of you." From his saddlebags he produced small treasures, a polished stone for Thomas, a ribbon for Emma's hair, and a tiny wooden whistle for Sarah. Simple gifts, yet the children's faces lit up as if he'd brought them gold. When he finally turned to Catherine, his smile softened. "And for the lady of the house," he said, holding out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Catherine accepted it cautiously. "You didn't need to bring me anything, Yates. I wanted to." His eyes held hers, conveying something she wasn't quite ready to interpret. Unwrapping the package, Catherine found a pair of soft leather gloves, practical yet beautiful. "These must have cost a month's wages," she protested. "Try them on," Yates urged, ignoring her concern about the cost. The gloves fit perfectly, the leather supple against her skin. Catherine couldn't remember the last time she'd owned something so fine, something that wasn't patched or mended or handed down. "Thank you," she said softly, genuinely touched by the thoughtful gift. That weekend passed too quickly. Yates split firewood, repaired a leak in the roof that had developed during a heavy snow, and spent hours playing with the children. On Sunday evening, as he prepared to leave again, Catherine found herself wishing he could stay, a sentiment that both surprised and unsettled her. "Next weekend will be Christmas," Yates reminded her as he stood by his horse. "I've asked for Friday off so I can be here longer." Catherine nodded, trying to ignore the way her heart lifted at the news. "The children will be delighted. They've been planning your Christmas gift for weeks." "And what about their mother?" Yates asked, his voice dropping lower. "Has she been planning anything for her husband?" The question, with its hint of teasing intimacy, caught Catherine off guard. That is," she stammered, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. Yates chuckled, a warm sound that rumbled from deep in his chest. "I'm just teasing you, Catherine. I don't expect gifts." His expression grew more serious. "Having a home to come back to is present enough." As she watched him ride away, Catherine realized with a jolt of surprise that somewhere along the way, their arrangement had begun to feel less like a convenient solution to a problem, and more like something real. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. The following week, Catherine threw herself into preparations for Christmas. She wanted it to be special for the children, their first Christmas without their father, but with Yates now in their lives. She baked cookies with the last of their sugar, made simple ornaments from pine cones and scraps of fabric, and even managed to put aside enough money to buy small gifts for each child. For Yates, she labored in secret after the children were asleep, sewing a new shirt from fabric she'd been saving. It wasn't much compared to the fine gloves he'd given her, but it was made with care, and though she was reluctant to admit it even to herself with growing affection. True to his word, Yates arrived on Friday afternoon, his saddlebags bulging with mysterious packages. The cabin, which had seemed empty without him despite its 4 other occupants, suddenly felt full again, warmed by his presence in a way that had nothing to do with the fire blazing in the hearth. That evening, as the children hung their stockings with excitement, Katherine found herself watching Yates. He'd changed in the month since he'd started at the ranch, his lean frame filling out slightly, his face more relaxed, as if he'd found a measure of peace in the work he loved. Catching her gaze, he raised an eyebrow in silent question. "You look well," Katherine said, slightly embarrassed at being caught staring. "The ranch work agrees with you." "It does," Yates admitted, "though I miss this place during the week." His eyes held hers for a moment too long, and Katherine found herself looking away first, unsure of the emotions stirring within her. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, the fresh snow outside making the world seem clean and new. The children woke at first light, their excited voices pulling Katherine and Yates from sleep. The gifts were simple but received with joy: a carved wooden horse for Thomas, a book for Emma, a new dress for Sarah sewn from one of Katherine's old skirts. Yates had brought oranges, a rare treat that made the children's eyes widen with delight. When it came time to exchange gifts between the adults, Katherine felt suddenly shy. "It's not much," she said as she handed Yates the carefully wrapped shirt. He unwrapped it slowly, his expression softening as he ran his fingers over the neat stitching. "You made this yourself," Katherine nodded, watching anxiously for his reaction. "I noticed your work shirts were getting worn." "It's perfect," Yates said, his voice rough with an emotion Katherine couldn't quite identify. "Thank you." He immediately removed his old shirt and put on the new one, the simple action feeling strangely intimate. "Now yours," he said, handing her a small package. Inside, Katherine found a silver locket on a delicate chain, not new but polished to a high shine and clearly of good quality. "Open it," Yates encouraged. Katherine did, gasping softly at what she found inside. On one side was a tiny portrait of her 3 children, their faces captured with remarkable accuracy. On the other side was a lock of hair from each child, braided together into a small circle. "How did you—" "I had help," Yates admitted. "Emma showed me where you keep the children's first locks of hair, and I took it to an artist in Virginia City when I had a day off." "Do you like it?" "Like it," Katherine whispered, tears pricking at her eyes. "It's the most thoughtful gift I've ever received." Without thinking, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a kiss to Yates's cheek, an impulsive gesture of gratitude that left them both momentarily stunned. The moment was broken by the children's laughter as they played with their new toys, but something had shifted between Katherine and Yates, a barrier lowered, a step taken toward something neither of them had anticipated when they'd entered into their arrangement. That evening, after a simple but festive Christmas dinner, the family gathered around the fire. Yates told stories of his childhood Christmases on the Wyoming ranch, while Katherine shared traditions from her girlhood in Missouri. The children, warm and content, eventually drifted to sleep, Thomas and Sarah on a blanket near the fire, Emma curled up in Katherine's old rocking chair. "Should we move them to bed?" Yates asked, his voice low. Katherine shook her head. "Let them stay, it's Christmas." They sat in companionable silence, watching the flames dance in the hearth. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, insulating their small cabin in a blanket of white silence. "Katherine," Yates said after a while, his voice serious, "there's something I need to tell you." The change in his tone made her heart skip nervously. "What is it?" He stared into the fire, seeming to gather his thoughts. "The ranch owner, Mr. Richards, has offered me a permanent position starting in the spring, foreman with a share in the profits." "Yates, that's wonderful." Katherine exclaimed, genuinely happy for him. "You deserve it. There's more." He turned to look at her directly. "The position comes with housing a small house on the property, large enough for a family. Catherine's smile faltered as understanding dawned. You want us to move to the ranch. I want us to be together, Yates corrected gently. All of us, as a real family. The implication of his words hung in the air between them. This was no longer about their arrangement, their practical solution to Catherine's problems. This was something else entirely. I don't understand, Katherine said, though part of her thought perhaps she did. Our agreement was temporary until I could support the children on my own. Things change, Katherine. Yates moved closer to her on the bench they shared. People change. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. I've changed. Catherine's heart beat rapidly in her chest. What are you saying, Yates? I'm saying that what began as an arrangement, a practical solution, has become something more to me. His blue eyes held hers, sincere and steady. I care for you, Katherine, and for the children, more than I expected to, more than I thought possible. Katherine felt breathless, caught between hope and fear. You've only known us for a few months. Sometimes a few months is all it takes to know where you belong. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I'm just asking you to consider making our temporary arrangement more permanent. And if I'm not ready? Katherine asked, needing to understand the boundaries of his proposal. Then we continue as we are, Yates assured her. I'll keep my promise. But Katherine, he added softly, I think you feel it too. This isn't just convenience anymore. Katherine couldn't deny the truth of his words. Somewhere between that first encounter in Eureka's muddy street and this quiet Christmas night, her feelings for Yates had transformed from cautious gratitude to something deeper, something that frightened her with its intensity. I need time, she finally said, not pulling her hand away from his. This is unexpected. We have time, Yates assured her. The position doesn't start until April. And Katherine, he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, I'm not going anywhere, whatever you decide. That night, as Katherine lay awake in her bed, she found herself at a crossroads she hadn't anticipated. When she'd accepted Yates's proposal of a marriage of convenience, she'd seen it as a temporary solution to an immediate problem, a practical arrangement between two people with complementary needs. She hadn't expected to find herself contemplating a real marriage, a true partnership based on growing affection and shared purpose. She hadn't expected Yates Forrester, with his quiet strength and unexpected tenderness, to work his way into her heart and the hearts of her children. The winter progressed, with Yates returning each weekend to the cabin that increasingly felt like a true home. Katherine noticed small changes in their interaction, a lingering touch when passing the coffee pot at breakfast, their shoulders pressing together as they sat by the fire in the evenings, the way Yates's eyes followed her movements across the room. She found herself looking forward to his arrivals with an anticipation that went beyond practical considerations, missing his presence during the week in ways that had nothing to do with his help around the cabin. The children, too, had fully embraced Yates as part of their family. Emma proudly introduced him as my stepfather to her classmates. Thomas shadowed him whenever possible, eager to learn men's work. And little Sarah had taken to calling him Papa Yates, a name that brought a suspiciously bright sheen to Yates's eyes the first time he heard it. By late February, as the worst of winter began to ease, and the first hints of spring appeared in patches of bare ground and longer days, Katherine knew she needed to give Yates an answer about the ranch position and what it meant for their future. One Friday evening, when Yates arrived for his weekend home, Katherine suggested they take a walk after dinner, leaving Emma in charge of her siblings for a short time. They strolled toward the creek that marked the edge of their property, the ground still hard with frost, but the air carrying the promise of warmth to come. You're quiet tonight, Yates observed, his breath fogging in the cool air. Katherine nodded, gathering her courage. I've been thinking about your offer, about the ranch position and what it would mean for us. Yates stopped walking, turning to face her. In the fading light, his expression was earnest, hopeful, and, I'm afraid, Katherine admitted, the words difficult to speak aloud. Not of you, but of what happens if this doesn't work. The children are already so attached to you if we commit to making this marriage real and it fails. Katherine, Yates said gently, taking her gloved hands in his. I understand your fear. But sometimes the greatest risk isn't in trying something new, but in clinging to safety and missing what might have been. His words resonated deep within her, echoing her own thoughts during sleepless nights. When James died, she said slowly, I promised myself I would never depend on anyone again, that I would be strong for my children no matter what. Strength isn't about standing alone, Yates countered. Sometimes it's about being brave enough to reach for happiness when it's offered. He stepped closer, his proximity sending warmth through Katherine despite the evening chill. I'm offering you a partnership, Katherine, not to replace what you had with James, but to build something new, something ours. Katherine looked up into his face, seeing the sincerity there, the quiet hope. This man who had entered their lives by chance, who had offered his name to save her reputation, was now offering his heart, asking for hers in return. Yes, she said simply, the single word carrying the weight of her decision, her willingness to risk her heart again. Joy transformed Yates's features. Slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished, he lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers. Unlike the brief, formal kiss they had shared at their wedding, this was a true kiss, tender at first, then deepening as Katherine responded, her hands moving to his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. When they finally drew apart, both slightly breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. I think I've wanted to do that since the day I met you, he confessed. Even when I was a muddy thief running through the streets of Eureka, Katherine asked, smiling. Especially then, Yates chuckled. You were magnificent, desperate but determined, ready to take on the world to feed your children. How could I not admire that? Katherine felt a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the physical closeness they shared. To be seen for her strength rather than pitied for her circumstances was a gift she hadn't realized she needed. So we'll move to the ranch, she asked, making sure she understood what this new chapter would entail. Yates nodded. If that's agreeable to you. The house is small but sound. Emma can still attend school in town. I've already spoken to Mr. Richards about arranging transportation. And there's good land for a garden, plenty of fresh air for the children. And us, Katherine asked softly, what will change between us? Yates's arms tightened around her waist. As much or as little as you want, Katherine. I won't rush you. But I hope that in time we might share more than just a name and a home. The implication was clear, bringing a blush to Katherine's cheeks even as a thrill of anticipation ran through her. I think, she said carefully, that I would like that, in time. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Then we have all the time in the world. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, the future stretching before them like the open Nevada sky, vast, sometimes uncertain, but full of possibility. The move to the Double R Ranch took place in early April, when the hills were turning green with new growth and wildflowers dotted the landscape in bursts of color. The house that came with Yates's position as foreman was indeed small, but solidly built, with 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a front porch that caught the evening sun. The children adapted quickly to ranch life. Emma continued her schooling in town, riding back and forth each day with one of the ranch hands. Thomas found paradise in the barn and corrals, shadowing Yates whenever possible and developing a special bond with a gentle mare named Daisy. Even little Sarah thrived in the open spaces, her cheeks growing rosy with health as she chased butterflies and collected eggs from the small henhouse Yates had built for them. For Katherine, the transition was both easier and more challenging than she'd anticipated. The practical aspects, setting up a new household, planting a garden, establishing routines, came naturally to her. The emotional adjustment to her evolving relationship with Yates required more time and courage. They had agreed to take things slowly, allowing their feelings to develop naturally rather than rushing into physical intimacy. Yates kept his own bedroom, though the goodnight kisses they shared at the end of each day grew increasingly lingering, charged with unspoken desire. By midsummer, as Catherine's garden flourished and the ranch operation ran smoothly under Yates's capable management, she knew she was ready for the final step in transforming their marriage of convenience into a true union. One evening, after the children were asleep, she found Yates on the front porch, smoking his pipe and watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. He smiled as she joined him on the rough-hewn bench, automatically lifting his arm so she could nestle against his side, a position that had become familiar and comforting over the past months. "The children are finally asleep," Katherine said, resting her head against his shoulder. Thomas was full of stories about the new foal. Yates chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her ear. "That boy's going to be a horseman if I ever saw one. He's got a natural way with them." "He admires you so much," Katherine said softly. "They all do." "You've given them something I couldn't," Yates' security, stability, a father's guidance. "They've given me just as much," Yates replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "A purpose, a family, a reason to put down roots again." Katherine lifted her face to his, gathering her courage. "Yates," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach, "I think it's time we truly became husband and wife, in every way." His arm tightened around her, his blue eyes darkening as he searched her face. "Are you certain, Katherine? There's no rush." "I'm certain," she assured him, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "I love you, Yates Forrester. Not just for what you've done for my children, but for the man you are, the man I've come to know and trust and want." The declaration, the first time either of them had spoken of love, directly seemed to break a final barrier between them. Yates gathered her into his arms, his kiss deep and passionate, expressing without words all the desire he'd held in check for her sake. When they finally drew apart, both breathing heavily, Yates stood and offered Katherine his hand. Without words, they extinguished the porch lamp and made their way inside, quietly checking on the sleeping children before continuing to Katherine's bedroom. In the soft glow of the bedside lamp, they came together as husband and wife, their union a culmination of the trust and affection that had grown between them over the months of their unusual courtship. Katherine discovered that Yates was as gentle and considerate a lover as he was a partner in daily life, attentive to her needs, patient with her initial shyness. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the quiet darkness, Yates pressed a kiss to her temple. "I never imagined that offering my name to a desperate woman would lead to finding my heart's desire," he murmured. Katherine smiled against his chest. "And I never imagined that being caught stealing a loaf of bread would lead to the greatest blessing of my life." Yates chuckled softly. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been in Eureka that day? If I hadn't stepped out when you were running from the baker?" "Sometimes," Katherine admitted. "But then, I remember something my grandmother used to say, that coincidence is just God's way of remaining anonymous." "Wise woman, your grandmother." "Yes," Katherine agreed, feeling sleep beginning to claim her, safe in the arms of the man who had started as her savior and become her lover, her partner, her true husband. "And I think she would have liked you very much, Yates Forrester." 1 year to the day after Katherine Kennedy had been branded a thief for stealing bread to feed her children, she stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching as Yates taught Thomas to ride his very own pony, a birthday gift that had reduced the boy to speechless joy. Emma sat nearby on the steps, reading a book from the small but growing library Yates had begun collecting for the family. Sarah played with a wooden doll house Yates had crafted during the winter evenings, her happy chatter floating on the warm spring breeze. Katherine's hand drifted to her stomach, where the newest member of their family was just beginning to make its presence known. She hadn't told Yates yet, wanting to be certain before sharing the news that would surely delight him. As if sensing her thoughts, Yates looked up from his lesson with Thomas, his eyes finding hers across the yard. He smiled that special smile that was reserved just for her, and Katherine felt her heart swell with gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought them together. From disaster had come deliverance, from desperation, devotion, from a momentary act of theft, a lifetime of honest love. And as the sun set over the Nevada mountains, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Katherine Kennedy Forrester knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the arms of a man who had offered his name to clear hers, and in doing so, had given her his heart as well. 5 years later, the Double R Ranch had prospered under Yates Forrester's management, enough so that, when the opportunity arose to purchase a small parcel of land adjacent to the main ranch, Mr. Richards had offered Yates a partnership rather than risk losing his valuable foreman. The Forrester family had grown as well. The child Katherine had been carrying when she stood watching Yates and Thomas that spring day had been a boy, James Yates Forrester, now a sturdy 4-year-old with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. He had been joined 2 years later by a sister, Grace, whose gentle nature belied the strength of will she displayed when things didn't go her way. On a bright autumn morning, as Katherine hung laundry on the line behind their expanded home now boasting a second story and a proper dining room, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Emma, now 13 and showing promise as a scholar, had just left for school, riding her own horse with the confidence of a girl raised on a ranch. Thomas, 10 and already showing skill with cattle that impressed even the most seasoned hands, had ridden out with Yates to check on a distant herd. Sarah, 8 and dreamy, was helping Grace collect chicken eggs, while young James helped by carrying an empty basket and chattering endlessly about the hawk he'd seen that morning. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Katherine's attention to the road that led to town. A rider was approaching Sheriff Donovan, she realized as he drew closer. Though relations with the town had normalized over the years, the sight of the lawman still triggered a momentary flash of anxiety, a remnant of that desperate day when she'd stolen bread for her hungry children. Morning, Mrs. Forrester, Sheriff Donovan called as he dismounted, tipping his hat respectfully. Sheriff, Katherine acknowledged, wiping her hands on her apron. What brings you out our way? Yates is checking the north pasture if you need him. Actually, madam, it's you I came to see. The sheriff's expression was serious but not unfriendly. Got some news I thought you should hear directly rather than through town gossip. Katherine's heart quickened. What is it? Hobson the baker he passed last night, his heart they say. Sheriff Donovan shifted his weight, seeming uncomfortable. Before he went, he asked to speak with me and the preacher, made a confession of sorts. A confession? Katherine repeated, puzzled. Yes, madam, seems that day years ago when you supposedly stole that loaf of bread. The sheriff cleared his throat. Hobson admitted he never actually saw you take it. He just assumed you had because you were poor and desperate and the bread was gone. Katherine stared at him, struggling to process the implications. Are you saying I was accused falsely? That I might have been innocent all along? Sheriff Donovan nodded, looking genuinely regretful. It appears so, Mrs. Forrester. Hobson wanted to clear his conscience before meeting his maker, asked me to tell you he was sorry for what happened. A complex mixture of emotions washed over Katherine's vindication, anger at the injustice, sadness for the frightened woman she had been. But underlying it all was a strange sense of peace, even gratitude. Had it not been for that false accusation, she might never have met Yates, never found the happiness she now possessed. Thank you for telling me, Sheriff, she said finally. I appreciate you coming all this way. Least I could do, the lawman replied, replacing his hat. I've had my share of regrets about how that situation was handled. You've proven yourself a fine woman over the years, Mrs. Forrester. You and that husband of yours have built something good here. After the sheriff departed, Katherine sat on the porch steps, her laundry temporarily forgotten as she contemplated the twist of fate that had shaped her life. A false accusation of theft had led to a marriage of convenience that had blossomed into the deepest love she had ever known. She was still sitting there when Yates and Thomas returned from their morning ride, both dusty and cheerful from their work. Yates dismounted in one fluid movement, his eyes immediately finding hers, concern crossing his features when he noted her thoughtful expression. "Katherine." "Is everything all right?" she smiled, rising to meet him. "Sheriff Donovan came by with some news. Hobson the baker died last night." "I'm sorry to hear that," Yates said, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly grieved. The baker had never been friendly to their family, even years after the incident. "There's more," Katherine continued, taking his hand. "Before he died, Hobson confessed that he never actually saw me steal that bread. I might have been innocent all along." Yates's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Well, I'll be damned, excuse my language." He glanced at Thomas, who was pretending not to listen while unsaddling his horse. "How do you feel about that?" Katherine considered the question seriously. "Vindicated, I suppose, but mostly." She squeezed his hand, looking up at the man who had become her world. "Mostly I feel grateful." "Grateful?" Yates repeated, puzzled. "If I hadn't been accused of theft that day, you wouldn't have stepped forward to defend me. We might never have met. And everything we have our life together, our children, this home, none of it would exist." Understanding dawned in Yates's eyes, followed by a warmth that still made Katherine's heart beat faster after all these years. "So what you're saying," he drawled, pulling her closer, "is that a false accusation of bread theft was the best thing that ever happened to you?" Katherine laughed, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Second best," she corrected. "The best thing was a tall cowboy who offered his name to clear mine and ended up offering his heart as well." Yates lowered his head to kiss her, a gesture that still held all the tenderness and passion of their early days together. "Best decision I ever made," he murmured against her lips. "Papa, Mama, you're being mushy again," Thomas called from the barn, his childish disgust at their display of affection making both parents laugh. "Get used to it, son," Yates called back, keeping one arm firmly around Katherine's waist. "When you're lucky enough to find a woman who sees the best in you, who builds a life with you through good times and bad, you don't take that for granted. Not for one single day." As they walked together toward the house where their children waited the family they had created from an unexpected beginning, Katherine reflected that some journeys begin with a single step, while others begin with a desperate run down a muddy street. Either way, it wasn't the beginning that mattered most, but where the journey led and who traveled by your side along the way. For Katherine Kennedy Forrester, once branded a thief for taking bread for her children, the journey had led to a life richer than any she could have imagined, alongside a man whose love had transformed a marriage of convenience into a union of profound depth and enduring joy. And that, she knew with absolute certainty, was worth more than all the silver in Nevada.